Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final lecture of the first week for business writing. For this lecture, you should have read Chapter 9, Section 1 in the textbook. I hope you did read that one in its entirety. It's fairly short. You should have also watched the other lectures and done the other readings because I'm going to reference the rhetorical situation, which I've gone over a couple times in this lecture. The point of this lecture is going to be to flesh out what's in Chapter 9, Section 1. It gives really good tips, really good pointers, things that maybe you should already know about being aware of who you're communicating with in digital environments, being aware of which abbreviations you're using and when, and things of that nature. So it gives really good advice, but I want to flesh it out with a little bit of research that I've done. Specifically, I'm going to draw in this lecture from a book called Networked by Raine and Wellman, and also a book called All Edge by Clay Spinuzzi. If you're interested in contemporary workplaces, those books are worth checking out, but obviously not a requirement for this course. But with that, let me share my screen and we'll get into the lecture. So what we're dealing with primarily when we're talking about netiquette and emailing and text messaging is or are information communication technologies. These have been described in a lot of ways, just on the fundamental level, they're what we use to communicate, and specifically technologies that have sped up and changed communication. A lot of times you'll hear resistance to them as if they're a bad thing, but that's not always true. And in this lecture, I'll point out the ways that ICTs can be a really good thing. But before we get into that, I did want to draw back to a diagram that came up in the textbook earlier. This was from Chapter 3, Section 4, I believe. But they were talking about communication situations, and this could go back to the word context from the rhetorical situation, where you have the readily apparent stuff, which are things like people's words, and then you have the not readily apparent stuff like people's moods, people's opinions, and things of that nature. And so in terms of information communication technologies, I usually express these as front stage and backstage. And this is where I'm drawing on that book, All Edge, I mentioned. The front stage is everything that you see. And so let's tie it back to information communication technologies. The front stage are things like the text message you read on your phone, the things that you see on social media, the emails that you get from your instructors. And that front stage stuff is typically all we see and sometimes all we think about. On social media, you notice it the most, where people say things like, oh, people on social media only share their best moments or their happiest moments. And so what you don't see is a lot of the sadness, the struggles, things like that. And so that's where we get into the backstage. The backstage is really the context. And a lot of times you're not going to be able to see the context, but you should at least be aware that it's there and think about what kinds of situations people are going through. So let me tie this back more clearly to business writing. So I mentioned on social media that you only see some of the happiest moments or proudest moments in people's lives, but it's really the same thing when you think about emails and text messages too. When you get an email or when you get a text, you get sort of the person filtering themselves into this media. And so you get a lot of readily apparent information or readily apparent words, but what you don't always see is the context or what they're going through. And so you never really know if somebody sent you a text message out of frustration, out of stress, maybe the opposite, out of happiness or out of optimism. But you should be thinking about what their backstage might be like. Are they going through something different right now? And would that change the words that are appearing on your screen? And so despite the fact that we don't always really think about it, and this is where I draw on the book Networked by Raine and Wellman, Despite the fact we're not thinking about it, we're always living under this system of what they call networked individualism. And so they argue that information communication technologies turned us all into networked individuals. And what does that mean? Well, they say it's an operating system. And what are the elements of this operating system? The first element they mention is that it's personal, which means we are still autonomous people acting in autonomous ways, even though we have all these technologies, even though we're influenced heavily by them. We're still just one person acting within a network. If we're thinking about this situation, for example, I'm doing a lot of things, right? I'm using Zoom, I'm using PowerPoint, I have a microphone over here, but I still am just one person doing one activity under my own volition or through my own decision making. Next, they say it's an operating system that's multi-user. And so again, we can kind of connect this to our class. I'm here doing all these lectures, but I know that the reason I'm doing it is for all the users, the people who are logging into the Canvas page, who are checking out the YouTube page, who are doing all this stuff. And so there's lots of users in even just our small network here in our course. And so when you think about the entirety of the internet or even the entirety of one platform, you see that it's not just one autonomous individual doing lots of stuff. It's lots of autonomous individuals contributing lots of different materials to a platform. Next, it's multitasking. I mentioned that a second ago, that I'm doing a lot of things right now, even though I'm producing one lecture, I'm also Zooming, YouTubing, using my environment to get back to our rhetorical situation words to sort of make a better product. And so it's always multitasking, and maybe even if we think about the user side, maybe you have this lecture up, but you're clicking around and reading other things or doing other things while you listen to it, which is fine. But it's something we should be conscious and aware of. And then lastly, it's multi-threaded, which means all of these multitasking things are going on all at once and on many different parts of the internet. And so I'm giving this business lecture and contributing to YouTube, but there are many other people doing the same thing. And we're all sort of trying to carve out our own little thread of the internet or of the network that's our home. But we should be aware that lots of different threads are happening at the same time. And so again, I mentioned a moment ago that the usual, I guess, professorial way of responding to this would be to talk about, oh, how, these technologies cause so many problems and move you away from yourself and things like that. But I want to argue now, and this is again drawing on Wellman and Raine, that that's not entirely true. In fact, there are huge benefits of this new operating system. For example, we have new ways to solve problems. So in your workplace, whatever you might do, you'll be able to consult with experts from around the world if you encounter a problem that you can't solve. In the past, it would have been tough to call in a consult from the UK or from India or from anywhere really, but ICTs, information communication technologies, allow us to do that and to do it fairly simply. There's more room to maneuver. I think here about if you're a LinkedIn user in your career, you'll probably find a lot more spaces to maneuver in your career, given your connections, because you'll always be aware of new opportunities that are coming up, of new employment opportunities and job postings and things like that. So in this operating system, there's just more room to move, whether you're getting a promotion or moving laterally to a company that more closely matches your values. Just this idea of maneuverability is embedded in the operating system. And there's more capacity to act. If you find a problem that you're really passionate about, something you really want to solve, you can connect with experts, you can connect with activists relatively quickly to solve those problems and to act on them. And so over here on the right side, I have the operating system's installation. I wrote it that way. These are the things that you might consider negatives, but again, I don't really see it that way, but these all accompanied this networked individualism's installation. First, the installation provided more opportunities and stresses for interacting beyond one's group. So for example, we're no longer a society where I know just my neighbors and maybe just the people in my local community. I'm someone who can connect with other professors interested in business writing around the world. But with that does come additional stresses, right? Because if I see somebody else who's networking a lot better, I might feel that I'm falling behind, that I haven't met as many people, and you might find that in your career as well. The installation offered communication and information gathering capabilities not seen before. And so to get back to another rhetorical situation word, this can also generate more interference because there's so much information, there's so much data out there that it's tough sometimes to filter what stuff really applies to your situation. And then lastly, the installation caused information communication technologies to become appendages. So even for me, I'm sitting here, my phone's right here, my computer's right here, all my tech is sort of a part of me and a part of what I do. And so again, this might be where people say, oh, it's a bad thing, people are always staring at their phones. But if you're leveraging these technologies in the appropriate ways to solve problems, to act, to network beyond your group, I think that the ICT as appendage can be a good thing as well. And so lastly, and this is sort of why I wanted to introduce you to all of that, is that with this new operating system comes new ethical considerations in your communication that you should think about, whether you're posting on social media, whether you're texting, whether you're emailing. These are all the ethical, well, not all of the ethical considerations, but these are some of the ethical considerations you might consider under this system. So first and foremost, just to reiterate, the networked self is a single self that gets reconfigured in different situations as people reach out, connect, and emphasize different aspects of themselves. And so while you are an autonomous individual and I'm an autonomous individual making my own decisions, I know that when new people reach out to me, when I join new networks on, again, let's say LinkedIn or something like that, I kind of change in certain ways because I get new information, I get new perspectives, I get new ways of looking at things. And so the network self is in some ways less stable, but again, not less stable in a bad way, just in a way where, to use the word here, we're being reconfigured often. And that can be okay as long as you stay aware of it. If you remember from the authentic authorship lecture, the last one of the aspects of an authentic author was to acknowledge the rhythms of one's life. And this would be one of those rhythms to pay really close attention to. And so just to get into some of the ethical considerations, or maybe these are also practical considerations, is that these networks create complex sets of relations. And those complex sets of relations require an awareness of these four things. I mean, an awareness of a lot of things, but to distill it down, let's just say the complex set of relations require an awareness of the flow of information. So when you're sending a text message or when you're sending an email or when you're posting on social media, but maybe not so much in that case. So let's narrow it down to text messages and emails. You want to be aware of the flow of information. So if you're going to send a report of a problem to a supervisor, for example, you should probably be aware if maybe they're already in the know about the situation. If they're getting emails from other people, you don't just want to be a part of a million emails going to one person. You want to be aware of the flow of information. And then on the other side of that is, how is that supervisor going to communicate it? If you do send an email, where will it be forwarded to? Who else is going to see it? There's a piece of advice out there, and I believe it's in your textbook, just to send every email like the president of the company is going to read it. And that'll be part of one of the case studies for this week. But yeah, an awareness of the flow of information. Next, you'll want to be aware of clusters of relationships, including the depth of ties. And so when you're texting, let's say a coworker, for example, and you're going to complain about something in the workplace, are you aware of their relationship to other people in the workplace who might also hear about your text message? Are they close friends with your supervisor, for example, and is your coworker going to report it up the chain and things like that? You always want to be aware of the clusters of relations when we're communicating. This one's a little abstract, to be aware of networks, but to use an example that's really practical for me that you can transfer to your situation as well. On LinkedIn, I'm part of a bunch of networks of technical writers and technical communicators. And so to be aware of networks, I would have to think, if I'm going to post in one of these groups, how will people in another group respond? Because you can kind of assume that people who are interested in tech writing are probably parts of both networks or in both societies and communities. And so in your workplace, you want to think about this as well. When you're building your professional reputation, are you aware of how particular networks are linked and why they're linked, and how maybe you can leverage those networks of networks? And then lastly, the thing to be aware of, or one of the last things to be aware of, would be where people have bridges and where people have weak ties. And maybe you can think about this for yourself. You can identify those people who are bridges, people who will always be there for you, who you can always reach out to for assistance and for help, and the connection will always be there. And who are the people who are maybe weak ties, who will help you out given the proper situation, but might not always be there in every case. And so that's just how I wanted to deepen the reading for this last chapter for this week. As you'll notice on Canvas, there is a Netiquette case study tied to this. There's one for building a personal profile of yourself based on your own netiquette. And I'll give you an optional way out of that to think about environment, to go back to our a rhetorical situation. And then lastly, you'll see a case study about emailing that you can think about all of the things in this lecture when you complete. And so that's our last lecture for this week. I'll look forward to reading all the discussion posts. I'll look forward to reading your case studies, and I will probably incorporate some of the information that I get there into next week's lectures. So thanks for listening this week. And again, I look forward to creating these again for next week. Thanks.